Hi, this is Tom Kemp. I'm the CEO of Centrify. Today, as part of our ongoing Centrify Chalk Talk series, we're going to be talking about DirectAuthorize. And what we're going to be talking about in part one of the two-part series on DirectAuthorize is we're going to talk about the needs and requirements in the market for DirectAuthorize and talk about the basic concepts. In part two, we're going to be talking about the more detailed architectural overview, data flows, how we store information with Active Directory, how the product works in Unix, etc. But in part one, which is the session today, we're going to be talking about the concepts, the market needs, etc. And I'm pleased to be joined, as always, with our CTO, Paul Moore. It's been a little while since we've done some of these. It's been about a year, so yes. It's great to get back in the saddle. I think the last one we did was on Direct Audit, and that at the time was a new product for us. And now this is a new technology, a new solution that we're offering. So why don't you just explain to the folks what is DirectAuthorize?
So DirectAuthorize is a fine-grained authorization management technology. Direct Control already has some technology for controlling who has access to what systems, but it's at a very high level, basically at the machine level. We can say which users can access which machines. We do offer some group policies and so on for slightly fine-tuning that, but DirectAuthorize offers a much finer-grained technology for allowing you to control and manage at a very detailed level which users or groups can do which things on which systems, and tie that back to their Active Directory group memberships and so on.
So it sounds like Direct Control enables the who and which systems, so who can log on to which systems, but it sounds like DirectAuthorize can control what they can do?
Yes, it controls in a very detailed way. Well, there's actually two modes it operates. The first mode of operation is to allow a user to do things that they would not normally be allowed to do. So it grants them extra rights to do things.
Okay.
So I'm a normal user of the machine, but I also need to, let's say I'm responsible on this machine for doing patch management on that machine for whatever reason. We can then say this user is allowed to do these additional commands beyond what they're normally allowed to do on that system. There's another mode of operation where we create a restricted environment for that user. So when that user logs onto a machine, they can only use these 10 commands. And that's the only things they're allowed to use. And that's obviously very valuable for very high value machines, where you want, when somebody logs on, you want to know precisely what they can do and that they can't be off even trying to do other things. Within that restricted shell, we know that some commands must be run as that user and some of them must be run as somebody else. So that's a much tighter control over what people can do, much finer grained at an individual command by command basis. We also have the capability of controlling when they can do things. So we can say, you can only do these commands, between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. You're only allowed to do this role, and we'll talk about roles a little more in a second. This role is assigned to you for the next 3 hours. Let's say a trouble ticket's been assigned to an engineer to fix something. We can grant them a role transiently, just for a small time window.
Does it also control how people can access that system?
There is a mechanism in there for controlling which bits of the network they can use to access the machine. So within Unix there's a thing called PAM, which is used by all Unix systems to control authentication. And we can say which ways they can be authenticated into the system. The net effect is, for example, they can access a machine via SSH, but they can't log physically onto the console. They can connect via FTP, let's say, but not actually get an interactive shell. We can control very precisely where they're authenticated as well as what they can do.
So the Centrify Suite, so we're obviously offering our products now in a suite. So Direct Control does the who can log on, what systems through the zoning technology.
Yes.
And it sounds like from what you've described, DirectAuthorize not only does what they can do, but how they can access the system.
Yes.
And when they can access the system.
Yes.
Right. And then the third piece, just to kind of tie everything together, of course, is Direct Audit. And so.
Yes. Yes. So obviously, there's this what they call the 3 A's.
Yes.
And now we've got authentication, direct control, detailed authorization coming from DirectAuthorize, as the name suggests, and then we've got direct audit, which provides the final piece, which is that we can audit everything that somebody is doing while they're accessing those systems, really sealing those 3 A's together tightly.
Yeah, that's neat. So let's step back for a moment here and talk about why people need this fine-grained authorization management, or oftentimes people call it entitlement management, with
right.
delegation of administration, as well as, I assume this also gets out of the situation in which people don't have to give privileged account passwords to people.
That's correct. So there's so the classic way that people manage their machines, particularly in a sort of poorly managed environment, is that people want to do some administrative task on a machine. They log on as root. They have to know the root password. The problems with that are then, once they've logged on as root, they have unrestricted rights. They can do whatever they like, A, and B, we don't know who that is. The system logs and so on just see that somebody called root logged on. You don't know whether it was Jane or Pete who was the person who actually logged.
So it's not tied to the actual user itself.
Correct.
Sharing accounts.
You have no accountability, you have no traceability. And shared accounts is one of those things that all of the things like PCI specifically says you should not use. So what we recommend to our users is that people log in as themselves, and then up until the availability of DZ, that they use various operating system built-ins, which are difficult to manage, but still are better than using that. So for example, they would use Pseudo to execute certain privileged operations, which you can do, but it's very difficult to manage. So the advantage of DZ is it creates a centrally manageable equivalent of that, which means that from a central location you can not only control and manage who has what rights, but you can also report and analyze on exactly what rights they have. So that's the principal reason. So we have accountability. The second thing is, especially as I talked about this tightly restricted environment, that on some high value asset systems, you don't want people logging in even if they log in as themselves. They can still run all of the commands that they can run just as a normal user, that in theory don't do any harm because they don't have any special privileges, but you never know, right? For the high value assets, you really want to constrain. When a user logs in, these are the 15 commands they can execute. And
that's it.
Because there's no reason why somebody who's a backup operator should be running other commands to do things. So it's an additional safety net to control access to those systems.
That's interesting. So as we come out with DirectAuthorize, I've spent time reading what analysts have been saying. And by the way, DirectAuthorize is going to be featured in one of our Gartner Group analyst series webinars that will be happening and actually available on our website even as a replay. But one of the reports from Gartner Group, it says, unlike Windows Active Directory, UNIX lacks a simple and scalable model for administrative delegation. And then it goes on to later say that the larger and more complex an organization, the greater the number of people who will sometimes need privileged access, increasing the likelihood of mistakes and deliberate attacks. So what is it about UNIX, and maybe this kind of dovetails with what you said about the backup operator, I mean, what is it about UNIX and Linux vis-a-vis maybe say Windows that this is a very acute issue?
It's an interesting topic in general to look at the security models of the Windows versus Unix, because of course there's a lot of tension between those two camps about which is the quotes more secure. So there are certain key differences between them, and the principal difference is that in the Unix environment you have very limited set of access control lists, ACLs, that can be applied to objects or operations within the environment. So typically what you realistically come down to is a user is either themselves or some super user, and that super userness tends to be applied globally. I mean, you do have groups within Unix, but they're typically only used at a very coarse-grained level. If you contrast that with Windows, Windows has exhaustively fine detailed ACLs on virtually every single item within the operating system. In fact, it's almost too many choices for a system administrator to set up. But what that does mean within the Unix world, it's very difficult to get that very fine-grained control over precisely who can do which
So is that leading to too many people having the root password or logging in as root?
Yes, it leads to people tending to have more power than they really should need, because it's difficult to create a user with just the right set of permissions. So you tend to give them more permissions than they actually need, because if you give them too few, they can't do their job. So you tend to end up with somebody with more power than they actually should have.
It was really interesting that Gartner said that organizations with mission-critical Unix systems responsible for OS backups can find themselves with upward of 50 people who know the root password. So I assume, from a compliance perspective, that's not good.
So. More than 50. I have actually personally seen organizations with even more than that.
Oh my goodness.
So and it's not because it's a poorly run organization, but because in real life deployments within a Unix environment, it's very difficult to do it any other way. It's not easy to manage them. Each individual operating system platform may have some OS-specific extensions, but to try and have it systematically across all of your platforms is a very difficult thing to achieve.
And it sounds like PCI, for example, the PCI data security standard actually has specific requirements.
It's very blunt. PCI is very blunt about it. I forget the exact paragraphs, but you will not have shared accounts. People must log in with something that's traceable to them,
yes,
Jane, and then if they're going to, then they can do some privileged operations after that, but you have to be able to trace it back to that individual person.
Okay.
And in addition, of course, you have to record what they did, which of course is
where
direct audit comes.
Section 7, Section 8 of PCI.
Section 10. You know the section numbers. I don't
exactly.
know the section numbers.
Okay, so that gives a good overview of the market needs and requirements. Now, you've talked about DirectAuthorize using the concept of a role and the concept of rights. So can you do me a favor and, for the audience, define what a role is and what a right is, how they map, and then how do you take roles and rights and map them, I assume, to users and probably even groups of users as well.
Okay, so I'm going to
use go for it.
It's called a chalk talk, but it's actually, we're in the 21st century, so we're using whiteboards and pens. So if we start with the definition of what a role is. So a role is a logical concept within DZ which it corresponds to a human who would be assigned to that role that has to do certain things. So for example, a classical role would be backup operator. This is somebody whose job it is to go to various machines to perform various operations on those machines associated with being a backup operator. You know, do this backup, restore that file, check the state of a backup that was run yesterday, and there'll be a set of commands available to do that. And so associated with the role for those commands is a set of rights. There's two basic kinds of rights. DZ is actually very extensible, where we can add additional types of rights, but we've actually just created two types of rights in our first version. So the first one is commands. So this defines what commands they can execute, and also how those commands will run. In other words, whether they'll run as the logged in user, or whether those commands will run as somebody else. You can tell us that. And then the other one is PAM rights. This is where we were talking before about controlling which part of the system they can come in through. So can
you define for the folks what PAM is?
Oh, sorry. PAM is a pluggable authentication module. It's the basic building block of the authentication infrastructure on Unix, and it's what direct control uses to authenticate and control the authentication of users on a Unix system with direct control installed.
So what are some examples of PAM applications?
So PAM rights are typically things like SSH. So what that means is if we create the right saying SSH, it means that people in this role will be able to log on to a machine using SSH, but they will not be able to log in using FTP, for example, or log in directly at the console of the machine, and so on. Other ones we can say is FTP, to access via FTP, one called login, which is the one which actually controls the login at the console.
So could you actually just set it up that a certain role could only have a write in which they have to physically be at the
yes, you
terminal?
could.
Okay.
Yes, you could. By just granting them this one here, they would only be able to do it by being physically present.
So I assume then this actually could also help people not use as secure, like rlog or RSH or rlog, and so that will force people to actually have to use SSH as well.
Yes.
So that is another added benefit from a security perspective.
So there's actually, if you look at a typical Unix system, there's about probably 15 or 20 different PAM gates into the machine defined, and those are all places where the system is doing authentication and or checking your account. So the authentication, obviously, the user and password is being presented. The other place is there's an account check going on. You've already been authenticated, but we need to verify whether your account is valid. Like, is it still enabled? Are the time restrictions on it, and so on. So all of those exist as choke points for us to be able to define what a role can do on there. This functionality here is very heavily based on feedback we've had back from customers already, as kind of, when they've been talking to us about their direct control deployments and the kind of refinements they'd like to have. This is a very common request. Commands here, just classical Unix commands, and they can either be individual commands specified very precisely, or you can specify wildcards for those commands and their parameters.
And then from a time perspective, you associate time with the role itself, so part of a role definition, or is that
so just to, a role is assembled by taking a set of commands, a set of things, and there's a final thing that you define associated with the role, which is the available times.
Okay.
There's actually two timing things available to do with a role, and I'll show you both of them. The first one is we define a role and we specify what times that role is usable. The classic example of that would be, for example, that anything to do with system maintenance, let's say it was a role called system maintainer, anything to do with system maintenance is only doable, let's say, at the weekends, or between 1 and 2 in the morning, or some narrow time frame where those things can be used. And what that means is I can assign this role to somebody, but even though they are a patch management user, they will only be able to actually do those things within the time frame. And here you can specify days of the week and hours within the day.
It could also, like if you have a contractor.
That's a different one.
Oh, it's a different one.
That's why I said there's actually two timing things. Right. So the first one is a definition of when you, even though you're in that role, it doesn't mean you can come and reboot the machine, at a prime production time. It's still constrained. Then we have a whole other thing. Just defining the role doesn't actually do anything. That just creates the logical idea we know somebody called a backup operator. We have to then take a user or a group in AD, user or a group in AD, and assign them to that role. So this is what we call a role assignment. So they are assigned this role, and a user in a group can be assigned many, many roles. And when we make the assignment, we can say, let's say on this one here, we can say start time and date, end time and date. And so that is the one that lets you do the contractor. So we can say that you've been given this, you're a contractor for a week, you're doing something on a particular machine, but only for this week. But once that week is done, you're finished. Another common usage of that one is, imagine there's a trouble ticket system, and you've been scheduled to fix something on a particular machine. You can grant somebody the role, the patcher role, for example, on that machine for a period of 2 hours while they're working on that particular thing. But once they finish doing it, that right is automatically revoked for them. Another common thing that we were asked for was the ability to assign a role to somebody, but to have to reassert that role was still valid. In other words, Yeah, you didn't want as a systems manager to say Joe is this type of user, and that would be true forever, that once a month we would have to reassert that Joe is a systems administrator on this machine. And so the role assignment still exists, but he can no longer use it. But somebody can then come and click and say, now give him another month on that. So that's the basic model of roles, the rights, and then the assignments of those roles to users and groups.
And so obviously DirectAuthorize is a companion product to Direct Control. And so Direct Control provides the zoning capability. And so can you talk about how that relates to zones? Because
Yes.
I assume you could have a backup operator role for one zone and a different one
Yes.
for a different zone.
So in keeping with zones being our kind of major organization.
And define what zones are.
Okay,
for
a
people.
zone is a logical collection of machines. So a zone is something in Direct Control where you can group all of your machines based on whatever dividing concept makes sense for you, whether who owns it, what type of machine it is, physically where it is. You can group those machines together, and we call that a zone. And then that is our main access. It's used for several technologies, but in this environment, the main one where it's relevant is it's used as an access control mechanism. If a user is also in that same zone, then they can use the machines in that zone. If they're not, they cannot. So all of our management tools are all focused on using zones as the top level management organization for controlling and reporting and analyzing. So unsurprisingly, DirectAuthorize uses zones as well. So a role and all the rights are defined within a zone. And when I make an assignment, I can either make the assignment to, let's say this is Joe here. When I make the role assignment, I can either say this role assignment is for the whole zone, or I can do it on an individual machine by machine basis. So I can say, for example, Joe is a backup operator, but only on those two machines there, or I can say that you're a backup operator for all machines in that zone.
I see. So actually, what would be some examples for a backup operator role? So I assume there probably would be a group within AD, or you could create a group called backup operator and assign users to groups right
yes.
there, and then just have a backup operator role assigned to the backup operator
Correct.
group.
Correct.
Okay, and so which is great because users can come and go, and as long as they're come in and out of the groups, you don't have to worry about it.
So we expect in a normal deployment that people use groups for most things.
And so the groups would be backup operator, what, DBA, web administrator?
Yeah, so yes. Of course, it's interesting that you would actually end up with a group that's almost the same name as a role, but then at the same time, then you can have different granularity levels. So you might have assign a role to a group, but that group can also be might control access to other things as well.
On the Windows side.
Not just yes. Or other things within the Unix environment as well. So typical roles are things like web application administrator, so somebody who needs to control the configuration of, let's say, a WebLogic server or an Apache server. Mm-hmm. DBA is a classic one there, and the command sets, we actually have a facility to create command sets that customers will be able to download from our site, which will be the command set for an Oracle DBA, or the command set for somebody using, let's say, Networker's backup tools.
So it almost sounds like it's almost like templates that
Yes.
that we provide, which is, so in a backup operator, so that's a good example. So what would be the backup operator, what would be the commands that backup operator would potentially...
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Okay, well...
So it's something... Unfortunately, I don't know enough commercial backup tools to be able to say.
Whatever the networker executable
there would be a
net backup.
It's going to have a command, which is, if it's net backup, it's going to be, we'll have a net backup as the command. We can actually do very fine-grained control over the syntax of that command that they can use.
Someone was asking me about that yesterday because, what if there's probably specific to the tar command that I assume, so the tar command or one of these backup could have different parameters or variables, and we could stop people. They could only run the tar with certain parameters.
Yes, we can control the exact command that they can
down to the parameter level.
Down to the parameter level. Yes, wow. And we can even do, if they type this flavor of the tar command, it runs as them, but if they type this flavor of the tar command, it runs as somebody else, and automatically do that for them.
And when it runs as someone else, they don't have to know that password.
No, correct. That's completely transparent to them.
So there's no sharing of passwords. There's no logging in as root or Oracle or backup.
Right. So the important thing I mentioned earlier on, I've actually put commands all in one bucket here.
Yes.
There's actually a subtle distinction between, I talked about the two modes of operation, which is I will say cool about granting extra powers to people, and then we've also got command definitions talked about restricting people, and those are quite different mechanisms. So in the granting permissions thing, a user can log on to a machine and they can do what they normally could do. They can still do whatever they like. They're a developer on a machine. They can do whatever they want.
But when they type a certain command, at that time it'll kick in.
So they actually prefix the command. They actually say this is going to be this is a privileged request, and I want to run this command as somebody else. Right. So it's very similar to how the operating system tools such as Pseudo work. The user knows that they're going to be running this command as somebody else. In the restricted environment, you explicitly enumerate the list of commands that the user can use, and you tell us when you define that this command and this command will run as root, right? Whereas these three other commands will run as the user that logged in.
And they can't run...
And they have no choice over that. They can't. It's not visible to them. They don't even know that it's running as somebody else.
And they can't. And you have 5, but if they type command 6, they can't run it.
The shell will simply say the command is unknown.
Okay, great. So this is really powerful, and as you said before, it sounds like you're right. A group called Backup Operator could actually have 3 or 4 different roles associated.
Yes.
Maybe that's a bad example, but maybe better example, maybe DBA.
Correct.
That they could do something with Oracle, and they could have a Sybase or MySQL role.
Exactly. That's a very good example. Yes.
All right. Great. So now the interesting thing is, and one thing we haven't talked about. So obviously, our customers know that direct control leverages Active Directory, and it sounds like, and we're going to talk more in detail about how it's implemented in part 2, but can you give a little bit flavor about how DirectAuthorize, you talked about it from a functional perspective, but a key element behind DirectAuthorize is the fact that it leverages Active Directory. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is probably, I think, the first and only entitlement management product for non-Microsoft systems that do that. So what is the value or benefit that people get from the fact that it leverages AD?
So there's several reasons why we chose to do it that way. The first one is that we wanted to maintain the very simple deployment mechanisms we have from direct control, which is we actually use the infrastructure you already have. You don't need to deploy any additional services or servers or databases or anything. And in fact, when you install and deploy DZ, all you do is a new tab appears in the direct control UI, and you just simply click on and say, yes, I want to enable DirectAuthorize, and that's it. There's no additional infrastructure to deploy. So that's one of the main advantages.
Both at the user interface, but also at the agent level as well?
You need a newest version of our agent.
Yeah.
So you install our agent, but the more importantly is you don't have to go and install additional servers on the network. You don't have to, on every site add
you don't have to set up a Unix server to be a management server. It's all part and parcel.
Or any proxy machines. Some products which do equivalent things, always you have to go to what they call a golden gateway machine to access to do that, and then that filters out what you're doing on the machines further down, which is very disruptive to how your users use your environment. So we wanted to be zero impact implementation, that you didn't have to deploy any additional machines, any additional services or data stores. The second reason to use it with Active Directory, is because for our customers are Active Directory customers, and so they think about identity as something that comes from AD. That's their identity master store is AD, and so it makes natural sense to use the identities and groups and so on that are already within AD to be the controlling entities within DirectAuthorize. So I can use the existing users and groups that are already there. And finally, because direct control already uses AD, we get a very nice integration almost for free between DirectAuthorize and direct control. The consoles seamlessly integrate together. As I explained before, the scoping of this is naturally at the zone level, which is the scoping rules that direct control uses.
Okay, so for the final topic for this part one is, you mentioned Pseudo before.
Yes.
And so that's probably what people are the most familiar with. And so it might be good if you can just spend a few moments just talking about the value that DirectAuthorize provides vis-a-vis Pseudo and how it goes beyond that. Beyond
yeah,
what
I'm
Pseudo
sure
offers.
a lot of people, when they're hearing this, just thinking, but surely isn't this just Pseudo kind of dressed up a little bit? And there's much more to it than that. So if we look at direct control, are currently deploying direct control 4.0 and 4.1, we do actually strongly recommend that customers do use Pseudo in order to get around some of the things we were talking about, the PCI requirements and what is just the right way of doing things.
And we have a group policy that can do bulk configuration of the sudoers file.
Exactly so.
Yeah.
We already do have mechanisms for doing that. But there are some drawbacks to that mechanism in that it's not maybe not as fine-grained as you would like, and there's certain functionality that the operating system Pseudo simply doesn't possess. For example, the ability to specify timing information, which we heard very strongly from many of our customers and potential customers, that the ability to specify times associated with these things were extremely important. The second thing is that managing and being able to report on who has what rights centrally is very, very important. Again, all the compliance requirements are all about not only controlling who can do what, but also being able to find out who can do what, to be able to report and query on that information.
So it sounds like even though we have a group policy with direct control that can do bulk configuration of the sudoers file, the reality is it sounds like when you use Pseudo, you're having the authorization be stored. If you have 1,000 servers, the information is being stored in 1,000 places, and so you don't get the benefits of centralization.
Correct. As I said, the group policy eases that pain somewhat, but it's still not ideal.
Yes.
It's very, very difficult to analyze it. There's also some subtle things about it as well. For example, the rights of people to be able to change group policies in AD are more elevated than the rights required to manage a zone within direct control. And one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that if you're a zone administrator, you should be able to control those level of rights as well.
It sounds like Pseudo also doesn't have some of the, I'm just looking at a piece of collateral that we have. It sounds like Pseudo cannot do the temporary rights assignment.
That's what I was saying, the time-based, and we definitely heard that was a very strong requirement.
And it sounds like it doesn't sound like Pseudo can also, because it's on a local system, they can't control how people access the system.
Correct.
So Pseudo doesn't provide the PAM stuff.
Pseudo is only this part here.
Okay.
And as I said, the DirectAuthorize infrastructure is designed to actually manage multiple different rights. We've just done this set of 3 to start with, the 3 being the granting rights. So this is the one that's most closely modeled to Pseudo. And in fact, it's perfectly reasonable for a customer, and we expect this to be quite a common deployment, that they just use this. In other words, they simply use this as a replacement for Pseudo with many more features.
The centralization.
Right.
Yes.
But the usage model for the end users is basically the same. Other customers will want to use other features as well, but we believe a common deployment will be this. But yes, we have many other features.
So it's they don't have the sandboxing, the time boxing, and then the PAM right there as well. Also, obviously, there's not the nice tie-in between there isn't the ability to link a role to a specific Active Directory group, etc. I mean, because we're providing all that infrastructure. Right
Again,
there.
you can, but it's not as easy and as seamless as it should be.
Yeah.
So we wanted to just make it flow very, very, very similarly.
Okay. So just to summarize, I mean, it's so Gartner Group says in the Gartner Group report, and by the way, this is going to be discussed in that webinar that we're doing with Gartner Group, so either see it live or see the replay on the whole authorization of non-Microsoft systems. But Gartner makes it very clear that the best practice is never let anyone log in remotely as root, but to force everyone instead to log in themselves and then gain privileges using one of the recommended approaches, which is obviously the recommended approaches is the granularity of fine-grained control. Right. So it sounds like direct control provides the accountability because those users are Unix-enabled Active Directory users, which you get with direct control, yes. And then DirectAuthorize adds the granularity from what they can do, right? So it's DirectAuthorize does the what, how, and the when aspect as well. Okay, wow, that sounds really neat. Is there anything else you want to say at a high level? I know in our part 2 we're going to talk about the architecture, how it integrates with Active Directory, the architecture from a Unix perspective. Any other high level thoughts?
I was just going to use your final finger as you were enumerating things there, and of course Direct Audit then records what they did.
Yes. So direct control is who can log in, what systems through the zoning. Right. The DirectAuthorize does what they can do, how they can do it, when they can do it, and then Direct Audit ties it all together, and those are the components, yes. The 3 products that comprise the Centrify Suite, et cetera. And of course, we also offered the Application Edition, and last year we did a webinar about our web support, and we're going to be doing some webinars on our SAP support as well. So thank you very much. Stick around for part 2 when we really go into a lot more detail with the architecture of DirectAuthorize. Thank you very much.